Retro.
Hey, this is Catherine Tabor, Senator Padme Amidala from Star Wars The Clone Wars, and you're listening to Jay and Dennis on Podcast Stardust. Stay on the light side.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
We are going to be looking at the second episode from Season 2 of Light and Magic in this episode. But Jay, I want to remind everybody where we can be found on social media.
Sure thing, Dennis. We are very conveniently found on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The dish is line, signals boosted to maximum output, shields down. We're now broadcasting the galaxy. So this is our look at Light and Magic Season 2, Episode 2. We covered the first episode a few weeks ago, and I'll try and remember to put a link to that in the show notes if you want to go back and check that one out. The first episode really dealt with the development of all the technology that made the Phantom Menace possible. This episode picks up with the aftermath of the Phantom Menace, and then a lot of more development of technology that eventually takes us to Attack of the Clones on this. And then there's some other things along the way. Before we get into the specifics, what do you think about this episode overall, Jay?
Well, I continue to be blown away by this series, Dennis, and just the idea that all of this technology, all of these advancements, all of these things that we now, very much take for granted were all because of the things that ILM did. And they were true pioneers in every sense of the word. And, there was obviously some hiccups and setbacks along the way. But it's just seeing all of these creators that are true masterminds and just true geniuses of their craft, just being able to go through the design process and figure out what works, what doesn't, what can we do better next time. Just the passion that they have for it is just absolutely incredible. And then, of course, there's some heartbreak in here as well with Ahmed Best's story and just putting it into the human perspective of things that, when backlash happens, how it can really, really touch more than just one life, but for that one person, just incredible. And so I'm just left with that feeling of just wow. And I'm just so grateful for this series. But what were your thoughts overall?
Yeah, a couple things. I like what you had to say there. I agree with all that. The other thing that strikes me about this is that, and you said it, and it really resonates, is that the stuff that we take for granted now that they do with special effects, it is taken for granted now. You just think of all the movies come out there. It seems like there's rarely one that doesn't benefit from having some sort of CGI, some sort of digital effects that's added to it to enhance things, to remove things from the background, to make the water do what it wants. And we'll talk about that as it comes up. And it was ILM that was pioneering all of this. And there's a lot of great, talented people. And I just love listening to them talk about things over this. And we'll get into some of their achievements and contributions as we go. But the man behind it all is George Lucas on this. And it's easy not just to take the special effects for granted, but to take him for granted in all this. Because, look, the prequels, especially The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, as much as we like them as Star Wars fans, there was backlash about the quality of the film, the quality of the story, the way, the directing, the acting, that type of thing that was out there. But that's not all he did. I mean, he pushed everyone at ILM to make all that stuff possible. He's the one that pushed filming movies digitally, presenting them digitally, making things more efficient, making them less expensive to shoot in that regard, and to edit and to produce out there. And the number of times it comes up in this special, how this one is called, it's like there must be a better way. And that's his mantra. He wants to
Mhm.
push the technology, and he did it time and time again. And when his team would say, like, well, we could just do it this way, when it comes to the CGI stormtroopers and Attack of the Clones, for instance, like, we're going to do mocap, and that's the end of it. and
Uh-huh.
and that's what the boss says, and that's what the end of it is. And so every time I see one of these episodes, in some, it's just I come to appreciate George Lucas even more, not just as the creator of Star Wars, not just as a guy who wrote some of these movies and who's directed, but so much of modern movie making is owed to George and what he pushed ILM to do. And that's just one of my big takeaways from all this.
Oh, yeah, it's so true. I mean, he was literally a man ahead of his time in so many different ways. Like, he wanted to do all of these things that he, could see in his head, but there was just no way to do it at the time. And then he
Hmm.
kept he kept pushing and pushing and pushing for it, and eventually created that, and made it a reality. It just reminds me a lot of the, geniuses in other types of areas like music and art and so on and so forth. And he truly is in that same kind of, vein as the rest.
Yeah. And so much of the time when we see him these days, he's soft spoken. And
Oh
it's like
yeah.
he doesn't want to be in the spotlight in here. But when he's talking stories, Joe Johnson's the one that's like doing the interviews for all this. He's very direct, and he's very confident in everything that he has to say and his memory of things. And well, anyways, I want to preserve some of the areas of discussion. And so I'm not going to get into a whole lot of specifics about what he say. But again, it's just I think it's so easy to have a perception about him based on his appearances over the last few years that doesn't necessarily reflect who he is. And this documentary here helps reveal who George really is. And I really love seeing that. So,
Right, right. Same.
okay. Well, they pick up with the aftermath of the Phantom Menace in this. And man, you touched on it. Your heart really goes out to the likes of Ahmed Best and Rob Coleman, who
Yeah.
were so crucial to bringing that character in to life. And when this episode starts, there is a trigger warning at the beginning, how there is a discussion of suicidal thoughts that goes into it. And we've all heard about how Ahmed had committed suicide based off the backlash that he got from Jar Jar's performance and all this. But to hear him tell the story just was chilling on
Yeah.
this. I mean, it's just to hear, I mean, it's essentially a survivor story, but to hear what was going through his mind and what brought him back from that, it was, I mean, like I said, I mean, it gave me goosebumps. It was really, really chilling.
Right, right. And again, not to go into the details of it because it is a very sensitive topic, but
Hmm.
as you alluded to, it's different when you hear it straight from the source and
Hmm.
just being able to put yourself in the perspective of what he was thinking and feeling at the time. And yeah, I just I had tears rolling down my cheeks, quite honestly.
Hmm.
And he handled it so well when the backlash was happening. He was so gracious about it. You could see from a lot of the footage that a lot of the interviewers would just almost blindside him with some
Hmm.
of these questions and try to bait him into being humiliated, on the spot, and he handled it so well, and Rob Coleman did too, for the most part. And I
Hmm.
mean, you're talking about your life's work here, and you're talking about the time and the effort and the passion and the energy that you poured into this work, and for people to just basically walk all over it, and how hard that must have been for them.
Yeah. And to give George Lucas his flowers again on this, the way he just kind of led these people through the backlash on this. Rob Coleman was despondent over what people were saying about the movie and Jar Jar. And then they were on the plane flying back to LA, and George calls him up and says, you look upset, what's it? And then, Rob's pointing to the reviews, and George's response is like, okay, but did any of these say he didn't look real?
Right.
And Rob is like, no. And he's like, well, then you were success. And then the other thing he had to say to all of them, which was, I guarantee in 10 to 20 years from now, people are going to be telling you that Jar Jar was their favorite character
Mhm.
on this. And I
Yep.
loved how they had Rick McCallum, Jim Morris was the president of ILM. Rick McCallum was the producer of these movies, and John Knoll, who we all know who John Knoll is the visual effects supervisor who's just continuing to do magic with ILM and Lucasfilm, kind of talking about this whole thing that, people forget these movies are, and George Lucas has said this elsewhere, they're aimed at a 12-year-old audience. And the people that were complaining about these movies were kids when the original Star Wars came out. We've had this conversation so many times, but George and John Knoll and Rick McCallum had the experience of getting that type of feedback that Rob Coleman and Ahmed Best did not.
Right.
And so, they were able to take it in stride. And, I hate that it came to what it did for Ahmed, but it does sound like there was a community there to kind of help, put their arms around their shoulders and say, guys, this is going to be fine. Just stick with it. And
Mhm.
that was reassuring.
Right. And it's so hard to, believe that at the time. But then as, it comes full circle and just the standing ovation and the welcome that Ahmed Best got at Star Wars Celebration Chicago in
Mm-hmm.
2019. I was there for that, for the panel, and it was just chilling in such a good way. And then to see his success since, with Keller and Beck and, and all the things. I mean, he's just really blossomed, and I love the way that the fandom has re-embraced him, and it's all because those kids that were little when Phantom Menace first came out are now adults.
Yeah.
So they were right.
When they showed that footage from the live stage at 2019 Celebration Chicago, I was like, I bet Jay and I are in the background if we looked hard enough.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
I mean,
I
I
did
didn't get to
think
I didn't get to the panel celebrating the Phantom Menace for its 20th anniversary, but he was just like at Celebration Japan, which we were talking about just a couple weeks ago. He was out on that live stage a couple times,
right.
and I remember being there for him. I can't remember exactly said, but I was there. That was one of the great things about that live stage. And I don't want to turn this into a Star Wars Celebration discussion, but just that you may not make it into the big panels, but if you hang out that live stage long enough, you're going to see a lot of cool people out
Oh,
there
yeah.
that you
Oh,
don't have to have a ticket in order to get into the big room for. And so, him, John Boyega, Daisy Ridley, Oscar Isaac, all of them, there at some point were out there. And that was just such an amazing experience. But let's move on a little bit here. They go from talking about that, and then we get a little bit about how ILM is growing, and they're mentioning that when they moved into, I think it was called Kerner, was their location. They originally had just a third of one of the buildings, but they were doing so much work. They now occupied an area that was 3 blocks by 6 blocks. And so they were just, growing leaps and bounds. And then it was Gene Bolt, one of the digital artists, who says, basically there is no problem that ILM can't solve when it
love
comes
that.
to making movies. Yeah, it's just kind of cool seeing the confidence there. I mean, these went
yeah.
from being the geeks that were doing, the geeks and nerds that were doing special effects to the in-demand, their confidence and their bravado was just like through the roof
Oh,
on
yeah.
this.
It's like Superman, pulling
Mhm.
open the button shirt to reveal Superman underneath kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's what they were to all these filmmakers, quite honestly.
Yeah. What did you think about the story about Twister and the development of the tornado? Because Steven Spielberg wanted to make a tornado movie, but he didn't know if the special effects was able to do it.
Oh, yeah. I was literally and figuratively blown away. And Twister
Mhm.
was definitely one of my favorite movies of the 90s, and so real looking. And just the idea that, this was so groundbreaking in the way that, I mean, nature in and of itself is so unpredictable and so hard to harness in a way that looks believable. And so they had to create these new programs just to be able to do it.
Mhm.
And I just, that whole process was just absolutely fascinating. And, just the idea that they used, what was it, Jim Carrey's The Mask as
Mhm.
one of the first things to do that process with, and then they were able to translate that into the tornado and just doing all the test footage and everything. It was just, like I said, I was blown away, pardon the
Mhm.
pun, but truly. But what do you think?
Well, I love how the series is introducing us to more people at ILM that I just wasn't familiar with. I had heard of
Mhm.
Rob Coleman before. I had heard of Dennis Murin. I had heard of, John Knoll, Rick McCallum, and all those guys like this. But we got introduced to Habib Zargapur. in the
So
last
cool.
episode when, he was doing work on the pod racers. Well, it was his expertise with particles
Mhm.
and how they like collide and do different things that made the tornado possible. And just kind of listening to him talk about this whole process. And, he's originally from Iran, and then he went, I can't remember all the places. He was talking about all the different places he had lived and gone to. And,
Mhm.
before he settled with ILM. And I'm like, why have we not heard more about Habib up until now? I mean, and it
Yeah.
may just be a hole in my knowledge of these movies and stuff like that, but I can't remember ever hearing him get this much attention here. And he
Mhm.
certainly deserved a lot more than he's received so far. But
Right.
anyway, that aside, just listening to him talk about how they put together this tornado made their clip. They got in the back of someone's car and they had to drive around a barn to reveal the tornado, and then sent the footage to Steven Spielberg and Kathleen Kennedy. And they didn't even have a script yet, but they could make the tornado. So then they went ahead and made a twister. I mean,
Right.
I love that story.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, and the fact that Habib was from a very young age, just this was his passion,
Hmm.
and he just chased it his entire life, and it just goes to show that, when you have such a love for something and just such an affinity for it, that you can just work wonders.
Yeah. Yeah. And then from there, they used some of that particle technology when they put together the perfect storm. And I can't remember who it was that said this, is that, I think it was Masioka, which blew me away that this special effects artist was also the star of Heroes on NBC all those years ago.
Uh-huh.
But he's talking about how, they had to make revolutionary technologies just so they can digitally drown George Clooney.
Yeah.
One of the best lines of the entire thing. Uh,
And I'll
I
admit, I have not seen The Perfect Storm. Have
Oh, I
you?
saw that. Yeah, it was years and years and years ago. I saw it in the theater, and I did not realize at that time how much CG work went into the ocean there. But it was the whole, they want to make water directable by the director, is the way they
Right.
put it there. And that makes total sense because you're either out on the ocean filming stuff, or you're going to have to get some gigantic tank of water and a wave machine and fans in order to get the effects you want. It just never occurred to me that there was it would take them months just to render a few frames, like 10
Exactly.
seconds of this film, because of the work that went into the water and everything that went into making it look real.
Yeah, and the precision just over and over and over again of having to do this. And,
Hmm.
once again, just the fact that nature is so difficult to recreate and you
Hmm.
don't realize, with the particles and, the water, they called it stickiness of the
Yep.
water, which was, you don't think of water as being sticky. But when it comes to recreating it digitally, I suppose it is.
Yeah. And I want to make sure people get their props. So I'm just randomly dropping names that came out of this, but Stefan Fangmeyer and Polly Ing, were two of the people at ILM that worked heavily on this as well with Masioka. And it's fun getting to see these other people behind this and the personalities that they bring to it, especially listen to Polly Ing and how she had that linguistic studies degree
Oh,
that
yeah.
combined like some like language study and then technology. She had a part computer science and psychology and all this stuff just so she could get her foot in the door at ILM. And then like when she was there, there's pictures of her and all the other people on her level, and she's cosplaying as Princess Leia. I mean, at
Yes.
one point. Uh,
Definitely appreciated
yeah,
that.
I'm sure you did. It's just like I said, you know, uh, there's a select few people that get most of the attention at ILM, and it's all deserved. But it's fun getting to see these other people that we didn't really get to hear their stories before. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
well, then we get into what we were talking about earlier with the digital cameras here, and which is the inspiration for the title of this episode. Is there a better way? Which is what George Lucas is always pushing the team to do. And you gotta love John Knowles' like humility and all this, because
Mhm.
after the Phantom Menace, he wasn't sure he was going to be asked back to do Attack of the Clones. I was like, John,
Right?
you-
Exactly.
after
Dude,
we
you're
heard all this,
genius.
yeah, everything we heard you do in the Phantom Menace, there was never any doubt in anybody's mind but you on this. And it's kind of an attitude that permeates all of these people. It's like, well, we get to come back and At any rate, so he gets to come back, and then there's this notion that they want to shoot this thing digitally. And it took them 6 years to get a digital camera. They couldn't get one in time for the Phantom Menace, but they finally got Sony to build one
Yeah.
for Attack of the Clones, because part of the issue was, as John Knoll put it, is like no one could understand why we'd want to shoot a movie with a newsroom camera type of a thing. And not only that, it was like it had to be 24 frames to match the way that films were presented on film, because that's what
Mhm.
prevents the flicker.
That's so cool,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah. And then all the things that came out of that, it's that, the grain when you're shooting things on film, that would cover up mistakes, but they had to be even more perfect with makeup and some of the
Mhm.
details, because the high def was going to catch it. Now, this is a joke that was going around all the time back when high def first came on, that, we would see exactly how old the people sitting behind the desk were when the news
Right,
came on.
on the news, yes.
Yeah. But getting them talk about it. The other thing that was cool, and this came up later with Fawn, I think his name was that, he's the guy that was working in the model shop. Yeah, Fawn Davis was his name. He was the Vietnamese guy that, was the big, and I use this term affectionately. It is not definitely not a put down, but he was the one that was geeking out over model making and stuff like that. And he found
Mhm,
out that
mhm.
after reading those movies, like, wait a minute, there's Asian guys in the background. I can do this for a living. Yes, please. But they were making these models, and the fear was is the high def was going to pick up the flaws. And for the first time ever, I heard someone explain the effect of the digital camera, how that it would fill in the gaps between the pixels by moving stuff one way or the other. So the models actually looked better on film than they did on the studio.
Yeah,
And I still can't get my mind completely
I
around that, because if
know.
it's picking up all the flaws, like with the makeup and stuff like that, how is it making the models look better?
Exactly, I know, it's just like a weird twisted universe, but it works.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, but, and then getting to see those models, like Padme's apartment building,
Yes,
was really,
yes,
really cool.
very cool.
What did you think of the whole clone trooper thing? I alluded to that earlier, where George wanted them to be CG and mocap.
Right. Well, of course, looking back on it now, you can figure out which is which and who's who, obviously, and we know, and we accept it.
Mhm.
And I definitely understand that where it was less expensive to do that than to make all those costumes, because I
Mhm.
mean, when you're looking at where do you want to spend your money and where do you prioritize how you want to make this film, if you can do it digitally, then why not, as long as it doesn't detract from what else you're trying to do. And, they obviously did it pretty well.
But that was the thing, is that it was going to be cheaper to make the actual costumes than it was to make the clones digitally. As John Knoll was talking about, we can crank these out and it wouldn't be all that expensive.
Mm,
There's
I
a
got
certain
I
amount
had
of
it just the opposite. Sorry.
yeah, but no, that and so, and George was one of those pushing this, is like, because John Knoll was talking about how there's this whole thing about getting the crutch yanked out from underneath him with this type of a thing, that it was important that he embrace the technology and use how to learn it, because that is the future. George is a visionary of this. Okay,
Mhm.
all that said, there's still a little bit of irony if you think back to the making of The Mandalorian in the last episode, when they needed all those stormtroopers. They had to
Yeah,
bring in the
I
501st
will
to do it.
first. Yep.
Yeah, instead of embracing this,
Yep.
which, I mean, maybe it's still cheaper to use the real props and stuff. But anyway, I just kind of that made me chuckle a little bit when I thought
Yeah.
about it.
Well,
Yeah.
I think too there's also I don't wanna say the push to go back to practical effects, but there's
Mhm.
definitely, a little bit of that swing of the pendulum back the other way too, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that with the development of the volume, that
Oh,
they
yeah.
can, it make you don't need one, a couple differences. There aren't as many stormtroopers in The Mandalorian as there was clones in Attack of the Clones.
Right.
So you didn't have to worry about doing all, animating as many stormtroopers and like that. So maybe that's one of the differences. But then also everything else is being taken care of the volume. Do you really need to worry about the practicality of the stormtroopers?
Mhm.
So there's
Mhm.
that. We can only speculate. Okay. But the end of this largely focuses on the creation of Yoda.
So good.
Yeah, okay. There's so much to talk about. So we'll just take turns here. What is one of the things that stood out to you about the story of making Yoda?
Oh my gosh, I love the whole thing with Frank Oz when he was
Hmm.
actually puppeting, and then he would get tired, and then you would just see Yoda just be like, "Ugh," and
Yeah.
he would just, like, go away. But just the fact that, the way that they were able to bring Yoda to life from the practical puppetry into the digital, and then reliving the first time that you got to see Yoda fight, in Attack of the Clones digitally,
Hmm.
it was just, oh my gosh, it gave me chills, and just to hear people talk about why they made the decisions that they made to have Yoda do certain things, in that way, but I just treasured that process from beginning to end, and seeing that overlap of the practical to the digital was just this is my favorite part of the entire episode, quite
Oh
honestly.
yeah. Yeah, this was huge. Yeah, back to what you're saying about Frank Oz. I mean, just like because I think it was John Knoll talking about how with Frank on there, he's always lying on the ground. No one can see Frank, and so he's got his hand stuffed up this puppet. And the way he would interact with everyone on set was through the puppet.
Right.
And so, and he would not break character. He's trying to do all these lines for Yoda, and then he's going like, "I've got one more line, Dan," just right
Yes.
through Yoda, and we'd have like Yoda turning around and looking at people, even though they weren't like in the middle of the scene. And so, and
Mhm.
then the other thing is that the original Yoda from The Empire Strikes Back was foam rubber, and it was much lighter than the silicone puppet
Yeah.
for one. And then the other issue is that they could just not make this puppet look as good as the one from The Empire Strikes Back,
Mhm.
which kind of blows my mind because, here we are all these years later. You would think the techniques and the technology would have improved to the point that it would been much easier to make a more realistic looking Yoda.
Yeah, but I remember even seeing the original The Phantom Menace and thinking, "Oh gosh, Yoda, what
Oh, it was,
like, what the heck?"
yeah, it was, I mean,
Bad.
it was okay, but it really did suffer on that. And now that they've completely replaced that Yoda with a CG puppet, it makes all the difference in the world
Mhm.
on that.
It really
But then
does.
Rob Coleman talking about how they would make sure they capture the ear wiggles because back in the day when uh, Frank was performing it, when his hand would get tired, that's when his hand would start to tremble, and that would give the wiggles to Yoda's
Yeah.
ears. And they
Mhm.
made sure they preserved that for this performance for the continuity because that's what people expect to see.
Mhm.
That is just like a crazy attention to detail.
Oh, yeah, that and just the little hairs, on Yoda's head and everything.
Hmm.
And I will say too, I was very heartened to hear what Frank Oz thought of the digital representation. He was all on board with it.
Hmm.
And I just, because that's gotta be you would think that that would be hard to see, "Oh, okay, so my puppetry wasn't good enough," but yet he's what gave life to that, and I
Hmm.
think that that's what he was happy to see that legacy almost, live on through because obviously he knew he wasn't gonna be able to do it forever, number 1, and it
Hmm.
gets tiring? So,
Oh yeah.
as we
Yeah.
saw.
One other thing that stood out to me is that Ahmed Best had input on the fight scene with Count Dooku on that. I'd never heard that before. Had you
I
ever heard
had
anything
neither.
before this
No, I
presentation?
had no idea.
Yeah, but he, the story is that he saw Rob Coleman, who basically read the script, which said something along the lines of, uh, "You, what was it? It's like they're going to have a battle that defies description, something
Mhm.
along those lines." And Rob went and talked to George Black, and that George is like, "Yep, that's up to you to figure out." Just left it up to him. I love Rob. He takes everything to heart in this,
Definitely.
the reaction to Jar Jar, what was going to happen with this fight between Yoda and Count Dooku. And so he's like crestfallen. He can't figure out what to do with it. And he runs into Ahmed Best, and Ahmed's like, "Yeah, you're going to come over to the crib and we're going to watch stuff and we're going to get this figured out." So they're watching Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan and lots of anime. And
Mhm.
when Rob saw Jet Li's The Swordsman 2, that's when he figured the whole thing out, what it was going to be like for this fight.
It's so
And
good.
yeah, and then it was kind of there was another documentary I watched that addressed this creation of Yoda as well, not as in depth as what they did here on Light and Magic, but they called this reaction shot of Yoda expressing his concern about the Clone Wars
Mhm.
the Widowmaker, because George was just never ever happy with it. And so the poor kid, I can't remember his name, the poor kid, I forgot to write his name down the notes. But, Rob Coleman's the supervisor here, and he would just be chuckling away, and George would just get frustrated. It's like, oh, poor Yoda, he's so sad this entire time, because they couldn't get the emotion right on Yoda's face that they were looking for.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And what did you think about this whole notion that Rob Coleman's like, we did so well with the digital puppet that we got the reaction shot, the nonverbal reaction shot. I had never thought about this
Oh, I
that
know.
way until he talked about it.
Mhm. Yeah, it was, again, it's one of those things that you take it for granted in a lot of ways, and it just kind of goes, over your head, or you don't quite read between the lines, but it's just they just know it instinctively, what to
Mhm.
do.
Yeah, and more specifically, we're talking about Yoda in Palpatine's office, and after can't remember the line even that Palpatine says, but Yoda does that kind of looking back over the shoulder reaction shot where you can tell that he doesn't trust Palpatine. And
Yes.
that's what Rob Coleman was fighting for. He wanted, if we did this right, George would give him some sort of reaction shot, and they got it. And it was so successful, they put it on the movie poster, which was
Oh,
just
yeah.
cool.
Mhm.
But one of the best moments here was when Rob Coleman snuck into the theater to gauge the fan reaction to the fight between Dooku and Yoda.
Yes.
And when they finally had the fight on scene and we got to see, they talked quite a bit about Yoda using the Force to pull his lightsaber, and they compared it to Clint Eastwood and like that, and how the audience just lost their minds and went nuts. I was losing my mind and going
Yes.
nuts watching that, because it was so much fun to see that crowd reaction.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you just get chills because this was
Mm,
before really the advent of anything like, Instagram or YouTube, where
mhm,
people are posting things all the time and these reactions and stuff, because they weren't sure how this was going to land with people, because Yoda was always the, wizened old, had to use the stick to walk kind of thing, and then would they buy into this Tasmanian devil kind of fighting
mhm.
style? And people, like you said, they lost their minds, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and just getting to see Rob be happy with that reaction was
Oh,
was really
yeah.
cool too,
Like
after
fly on the wall kind of thing.
after all the
Yep,
concern that he expressed. But yeah,
definitely.
I mean, we covered this episode here. I didn't want to do it in too much detail because I think there's a lot of fun. I want to leave surprises for people if they haven't watched it yet themselves to go back and cover. But I can't get enough of this series. This is just so good. We got
Mhm.
one left. And again, as we usually say, when we get to the end of things, it'll be bittersweet here, but I can't wait to watch it and talk about it next week on
Right,
the
me too.
podcast, because these first two have just been so amazing.
Yes, they really have, and again, just quite a gift, because you just really appreciate it so much more when you get to see these behind the scenes kinds of things, and I just love the BTS stuff anyway, so it's a
Mhm.
win-win.
Right. Okay. Well, then that'll do it for this episode of Podcast Stardust and a discussion of episode 2 from season 2 of Light and Magic. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. And Jay will give you some places you can contact us here in just a bit if you want to do so. If you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to the podcast. That will get you our discussion of episode 3 from season 2 next week, as well as everything else we're doing, including our discussions of Andor that we've done, our monthly series looking at Revenge of the Sith for its 20th anniversary, Jay's World Between World episodes where she talks about recent Star Wars fashion and lifestyle finds. We got a lot of great features that we do here. Subscribe and you'll make sure you don't miss any of them. Once you've done that, head over to retrozapp.com. You're going to find a whole lot more past episodes of the show than what you're going to get on your podcatcher. And while you're there, you're going to find some other great podcasts covering all kinds of aspects of geek culture. A lot of great stuff to discover over at RetroZap. Jay, you want to remind everybody what our social media contacts are one more time?
Absolutely, Dennis. And the easiest way to get in touch with us on our socials is on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. And you can also check out some other fun outlets that we have, including our Pinterest pages. And if you're looking for more places to tune in, we have our YouTube and YouTube Music. So you can head over to both of those, like, subscribe, share those out. And please let us know what you thought of this edition of ILM and any other one of our episodes that we've put out there as well. And we're getting up very close to episode 900 soon. So there's lots and lots for you to discover. And we also have a TeePublic store, which has 7 different Podcast Stardust logo designs available on everything from t-shirts and sweatshirts to home goods and everything in between. So if you're interested in that, every one of those purchases does help to support the show. And the link to that will be in our show notes.
All right. You want to give everybody the latest on cosplay?
Sure. So you can always check out my Instagram at j.snipscosplay for the latest in everything that I'm up to as Ahsoka, 2 different versions of Hera, the Fourth Sister, my original concept Mandalorian, and more. And right now, a little quiet, but I do have a couple of events coming up here in June and July. So you'll have to once again check out j.snipscosplay for all the details there.
All right. Okay. Upcoming on the show on Wednesday, we are looking at Rogue One through the lens of season 2 of Andor. So make sure you stick around for that one. And then on Friday, we'll be ending the week with the roundup of recent Star Wars news. So with that said, thanks for listening to episode 894 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.